I am George Harvey, and this is Tom Finnell.
I am Tom Finnell, and this is George Harvey.
How about that? And this is Energy Week with George Harvey and Tom Finnell. And what we normally do is go through the headlines of the last week for about a half an hour and then talk. But what we're going to do today is headlines because we weren't able to record last week because of Thanksgiving. So I'm going to launch right into that. And we're starting with the 22nd of November. And what this says is, according to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's Office of Energy Projects, that's a mouthful, 694 megawatts of new renewable energy was added on October. 99.3% of the total amount was renewable. And of that capacity, 72% was solar and 18% was biomass and 9.4% was wind power. And what happened, this is the next line, wind and solar were the fastest growing technologies. In 2012, wind capacity grew 28% to 60 gigawatts in the United States. Is that the United States? Yes, it is. And PVs grew 83% year over year to 7.3 gigawatts. And you know, that was not a surprise to me. I mean, it's a little bit high. 83% is a little bit high, but compared to previous years, it's not all that high. And PVs get installed so fast that it's really easy to get them to grow. But you know, think about this for a minute. At 7.3 gigawatts, growing at 83% per year, how long does it take for these things to cover the globe? I mean, really, this is unbelievable.
Well, you know, it's interesting because PV is growing, as we speak, more or less like Topsy.
That's right, yes, it is.
It's growing independently. I mean,
yep.
You drive along the countryside,
yep.
and you go down a road, and you go down the same road next week and somebody's got a TV set up in his backyard.
Yeah, and they raise goats under them.
This is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's real grassroots. This is grassroots.
Well, you know,
stuff.
I for those of you who don't know, I write for Green Energy Times, and I was assigned a job of finding out what were the biggest solar arrays in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. And I found it was not possible to find out. It just wasn't possible because they're being built so fast. And I did a report on Vermont that said that we had 34 megawatts of solar in Vermont, most of which, more than half of which, was just ordinary people's solar.
Yeah.
And the largest solar farms in Vermont at the time that the data was assembled that I was working from were about 8 farms that were 2.2 megawatts each, because that was the limit of net metering, I think. But since I wrote the article, more information has been coming in, and more information has been coming in. And this guy's got 5 megawatts, and that guy's got 3.5. And Brattleboro is putting in a big array, and you know, it's an entirely different thing than it was not that long ago. Anyway, I think we should go on. As House and budget negotiators look for ways to lower deficits, our own Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, and Representative Keith Ellison from Minnesota, introduced legislation to eliminate tax loopholes and subsidies that support oil, gas, and coal.
All the poor guys.
All the poor guys.
They really need those subsidies.
Well, you know what? They will very soon. They really will. They're in trouble. Duke Energy, this is on the 23rd of November. Duke Energy agreed to pay $1 million over the deaths of more than a dozen protected eagles that were killed at wind farms. 14 eagles. These were not endangered species. They were, in fact, golden eagles, which are protected but not endangered. And there's more going to be coming about that. I'm also writing an article about avian deaths. And there was a really, really interesting study that was done by I think it was the Canadian government, but it was a Canadian study. And they found that unsurprisingly, the greatest number of birds killed by direct or indirect result of human activity were birds that were killed by cats, which are not a native North American species. They were brought in. And
it's significantly higher. I mean, like 1,000 to 1.
Yeah, more than 1,000 to 1. These birds were being killed in the numbers of tens of millions, hundreds of millions by cats. They had a list, and I'm not entirely happy with the list, but wind turbines were number 19 on the list.
You wouldn't think that if you follow what's in the news.
Yeah. Number 18, gill fishing nets.
Well, just plain farmers plowing their fields is way up there.
It is. It's way up there. And the big thing with farming is haying, because the haying destroys birds' nests. So anyway, TEPCO has removed 22 fuel assemblies as of the 23rd of November from the Fukushima plant. That, I'm sure, is still ongoing. They're probably at a multiple of that by now. The DOE's National Renewable Energy Laboratory on the 25th released a 128-page renewable energy data book providing data on renewable energy, and it now supplies 12.4% of U.S. demand and 23% of worldwide demand. And that may seem a bit much, but there's a huge amount of energy in the world that's supplied by biofuel. And it is not favored in the United States the way it is elsewhere. Big deal elsewhere. Nebraska, rated third among states for its wind energy potential, and yet a year ago it ranked only, this is a third for potential, not for the amount, it ranked only 26th for the actual wind energy production. And people who are familiar with the situation in Nebraska say this is because of one person who is anti-wind and anti-solar. Really. One person. And he happens to be in a position of authority that he can exercise. And even though people want to be generating wind power in Nebraska, they can't, because he stops them. And we will see more of that. U.S. Ecotech Institute released its Clean Jobs Index, which shows that more than 1 million job postings in clean energy sector occurred between July 1st and September 30th. Over 1 million jobs.
That's pretty significant.
It's significant. I wonder.
More than Walmart.
More than, well, I don't know about that. These numbers reveal a 54% increase from the previous year.
Well, one of the things that's happening here is you can think about putting up solar, and inside of 3 months you've got it.
Yes.
You think about putting up nuclear, that's going to be 10, 15, 20 years before you see it.
There's one nuclear plant in the United States that was started over 20 years ago, and it's still not done. And every once in a while somebody says, well, I think we should finish this. Okay. Bills pending in the Vermont State House and Senate would have Vermont Public Employee Pension Funds sell off their investments in any company that has a principal business in the extraction, production, or manufacture of fossil fuels. And I think that's a good idea. Even if you don't go with the idea of divestment as a political statement, these guys are in trouble. They are. And we will get back to that some more. The Tasmanian government. You know where Tasmania is.
Yeah, it's down around Australia somewhere.
That's right, somewhere. I actually looked
They have
it up.
devils down there.
They have what?
Devils.
Yes, that's right. I looked it up because I knew where it was, but I didn't know what the population was, and I didn't know what the area it was. And Tasmania is about a third of the size of New England, and it has a population that's slightly smaller than the population of Vermont. It is a place that has some areas that are kind of warmish because they're close to the ocean, and the ocean is warm. It has other areas that are cold. They are aiming at 100% renewable power for their power structure. That is the state of Tasmania. And there's a lot of difference between state governments in Australia and the national government, which wants to pursue coal, believe it or not. But what can I say? Okay, this is the one that I put in blue and made bold. And this is an opinion piece that appeared in Forbes magazine. Forbes magazine. This is a magazine that is well known. The guy named Forbes who ran for president a number of years ago, that's his magazine.
Doesn't their masthead call it a capitalist tool?
It might.
I think it does.
Yeah, well, I wonder how the word tool is used there. Whether this is the tool of capitalists who are trying to use it for some purpose. In this particular case, we have an article called, quote, "As we consume more fossil fuels, air quality actually improves," end quote. And my comment in my blog, which by the way is geoharvey.wordpress.com, if you want to look at it. And if you don't want to look at it, I won't hold it against you. For the record, this sort of thing supporters of the fossil fuels want us to believe, using flawed logic. There's a word for the logic. It's called cum hoc ergo propter hoc, which means with this, therefore because of it.
Okay.
All right? Yeah. I am sitting with Mary Jane in the backyard consuming mint juleps, and the rain comes. Therefore, the rain comes because I was sitting with Mary Jane consuming mint juleps.
Well, that's very logical.
Well, yeah, okay. They kind of left out of the mix here that there were a few changes in laws and pollution standards and so forth. But that was an article that appeared in Forbes magazine, and Forbes apparently has little enough to respect for its readers. That's my take on it, that they allow things like that to be published. Okay, on the 27th, Renewable Energy Vermont has asked Governor Shumlin to support the state's net metering program. This is something that is an important issue in Montpelier right now. The net metering program allows for people to tie onto the grid and sell power that is produced at their homes or wherever their installation is. And they sell to the power company that supplies power to their area, and the power companies are only required to take power up to 4%. And they have hit 4% in a number of places. It happens that Green Mountain Power has not yet, and they have indicated that they will continue to accept new clients on the net metering, even when they get to 4%. But the other ones have said that they are limiting things now.
Well, they're pretty small outfits, though.
They're pretty small outfits. That's right. I forget what percentage of Vermont Green Mountain Power supplies, but I think it's like 80%, something.
It might be more than that.
It might
It's
be.
way up there.
It's way up there. Okay, the president of Taiwan, I love this, says safety at the 4th nuclear power plant was enhanced by a system that can destroy the plant to prevent radiation leaks. This sounds like, oh my gosh.
We destroyed the village in order to save it.
The system would come into operation if a disaster is about to happen. Okay.
In a backwards way, I think it makes sense.
It does, but it just sounds awful. And of course, how do you test it? Do you really know this is going to work? It could backfire, and if it does, you've got a horrible problem on your hands. Okay. And we're back to birds. Every source of electricity we have kills some number of birds, and while solar panels are better than anything else, it is clear and somewhat uplifting that wind turbines fare better than nuclear and fossil fuel plants in bird kills.
Well, that's interesting.
Isn't
Elaborate on that, because it's sort of counterintuitive.
It is. You don't see a lot of whirligigs going around at nuclear plants. And fossil fuel plants I can believe because of emissions. But why nuclear would kill birds, I do not know. I know they kill a lot of fish.
Yeah.
But, and you know, I mean, the thing at Indian Point, I read last year, the question was, were they killing 100 million fish a year, or were they killing 1 billion? And the answer to that depended upon which side of the argument you were listening to. Because the pro-nuclear people were saying, no, it's only 100 million. And of course, part of the problem with that, and you know, I've got to come clean on this, part of the problem is that the fish that are being killed are mostly very, very small. Very small. So these are fry that have just hatched, but you know, they would be somebody's dinner more than likely anyway. Central America, I love this. Central America has launched a range of clean energy options, projects to address climate change, high oil prices, and power in remote regions. Now, and you got to remember, there's a bunch of countries down there. This is Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Belize. I'm probably missing something, more than something.
Panama.
I said Panama, I think. Anyway, they are at 65% of their power supply coming from renewable sources now.
They have a lot of hydro down there.
65. Yeah, they started with a lot of hydro. There are a bunch of countries that started with a lot, and but they're up to 65% now, and that I think is pretty impressive. Here's another good one for people who are shopping for Christmas. Lego Group. This is the organization that makes the toys. They're Danish. Yeah. Has announced that they will be 100% renewable, and I don't have it down here, but my recollection is that was by 2017. They're almost there now, but they're going to be 100% renewable. Not just their companies, but also the sources that they get their materials from.
That's interesting.
This is a big deal.
There's something going on here that's not getting a lot of publication.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies on their own are putting up solar just because they're saving money. And you mentioned Lego. I wanted it. They're Danish.
They're Danish.
What's that Swedish company that makes furniture? IKEA.
IKEA.
They've
been putting it up like mad.
And even Walmart's doing it.
Walmart is actually the biggest.
Are they really?
Yeah, they are. They are the biggest company.
And they're not doing it because of the kindness of their heart.
Well, I think there are a lot of people who would assume that about Walmart, yes. But the fact is, they have, and they do have, I believe Amory Lovins, who's the head of the Rocky Mountain Institute, is on their board of directors. And he has been moving the board in the direction of renewable power and reducing their climate impact and sustainability. But yeah.
Well, I think what's happening here is, despite it, well, probably in part because of the thinking of green supporters, this has raised their consciousness being raised, and then the bean counters are getting involved, and they're saying, hey, you know, hey, this is good for the bottom line.
That's right. Yeah, that is right, and it doesn't take very much thought to figure that out when you look at the cost of putting solar in, for example, and the cost of the cost of the electricity that's replacing. And this is true not just of solar. There are places where this is being done with wind power. There are places where it's being done with hydropower. There are very interesting kinds of hydropower that do not disturb the flow of the water in a river. And there's a really good example of that coming up. But it's, yeah. Yeah. Moving on. Bright Source Energy, U.S. company, is specializing in solar thermal electric operation, is about to inaugurate the largest solar power plant ever built. It's concentrating solar, and the sunlight is gathered by 170,000 mirrors.
This is one of these things in the desert where
Yeah.
there's this huge tower and
Yes,
all
that's
these
right.
mirrors.
Yes.
And they're all computer controlled
Yes.
and synchronized, and
Yeah.
they shoot all their light on this tower.
Yep.
That itself is an amazing concept.
It is, and one of the things that's interesting about it is they're heating up some medium. And the medium could be water, but in most cases I think they need to have a higher boiling point than water is capable of. I think
That's
they
sodium,
use
isn't it?
liquid salt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I was thinking of sodium, but
It might be.
metallic sodium,
Yeah, it might be.
which melts pretty low.
Yeah, it also does some other interesting things.
Well, you got to keep it away from air.
If you take a lump of sodium and you drop it in a bucket of water,
Yeah.
what does it do?
It turns into gas. It liquefies the hydrogen.
It'll catch fire.
Yeah, right.
I love it.
I'm going to
Science is
tell you
so
a funny
lovely.
story about sodium and interject. It has nothing to do with energy, but it has to do with the electrical industry.
Okay.
I was working for a company that made electrical cable,
Uh-huh.
and they were working in conjunction with Union Carbide. And Union Carbide came up with a method of making sodium conductor cable,
Okay.
which is a pretty good conductor of electricity.
Okay.
And they had ends that would seal the cable and everything else. And they had the system worked out pretty well. And we were putting in a trial installation in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Jersey Central Power and Light was the utility.
Mm-hmm.
And I was down there. And we had photographers down there and everything else. It's going to be a big public relations thing for us. Well, they had the trenches dug out. They laid the cable down, and it was getting toward the end of the day, so we didn't finish. Overnight, it rained. It wasn't that bad, but when we came back in the morning, there was no fires or anything like that because they had the technology covered to seal the ends and all of that, so that wasn't a problem. But the cables were floating in the ditches.
Oh, no.
Nobody calculated that the total weight of the sodium in the plastic would be less than that of water,
Okay.
and they floated. Now here we're
thought you were
dealing
gonna
with
tell me
probably
that-
50 engineers, and nobody thought of it.
I thought you were going to tell me that a rat had bitten it. or
No,
something.
nothing really bad happened. Everybody got a good laugh out of it.
I'll bet.
And,
Yeah, okay. Well, a recent GE announcement noted that E.ON, Climate and Renewables, will power up 469 of its GE 1.5-77 wind turbines. I would assume that's 1.5 megawatts, with brilliant technology. Brilliant in quotes, it's the name of the technology. The goal is to boost the wind turbine output by 5%. And if you can boost the output by 5%, you can boost profits by 20%.
oh, I don't know how the math works out.
Well,
but
the math
that
is
sounds
you've got
pretty good.
costs,
Yeah.
and the costs are going to be the same.
Costs are fixed, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So anything that you can add there is going to be profit. Obviously, you have to cover the cost of the change. But as wind becomes more efficient, as solar becomes more efficient, we're back to the reason why we should divest from fossil fuels, because they're not becoming more efficient.
Correct.
And they can become more efficient, but the problem is that they've got to deal with the emissions and the cost of emission control. I don't know what the cost of a coal burning plant is today versus what it was 20 years ago, but the cost of a new coal burning plant is a large percentage of the cost of a nuclear power plant, and nuclear power is unbelievably costly. So anyway, the International Energy Agency now sees that wind power will probably be producing 18% of global demand by 2050. This is up from their earlier estimate of 12%. I'm going to bet both of those are wrong. I think they're probably going to be more than 18%. But that's just a gut hunch on my part, and they've been doing their homework. Solar PVs are on the rise. Does this sound like a refrain in a song? it sounds like we've been saying this over and over again. Currently, the whole world has installed 130 gigawatts of PVs, a huge increase over the number of the year 2000. We have 130 as of whenever the data was put together. In 2000, you want to guess what there was instead of the 130 we have now?
I couldn't venture a guess.
1.4.
Wow.
1.4. This is just unbelievable. And 80 gigawatts of that power is in Europe. Tax breaks for wind power producers are set to expire at the end of in a little more than a month, and that threatens a lot of jobs. And this particular article was written from the point of view of Iowa, and there is a calculation that if Iowa has already got 25% of its power from wind, and according to this thing, they say by 2017, if the current laws are continued to that point, instead of just allowing them to expire at the end of this year, by 2017 they will be getting 50% of their power from wind. And you know, I don't remember what the numbers are, but it occurs to me that what I read about Iowa was that they have enough wind power capacity in Iowa to provide a multiple of what the U.S. capacity is. And my recollection is that if you take the Midwestern states running from Mexico to Canada and you add their capacities up, it's a multiple of world demand.
Wow.
We've got huge resources.
This is the prairie you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. It's Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, plus Iowa, plus parts of Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico. But it's basically the flatlands. It puts a new meaning on the term flatlander. Okay, the European Commission, you remember we were talking about Hinkley C and how expensive it was.
Yeah.
And I will point out, I said I don't think this is ever going to happen. The European Commission has launched an investigation into whether the British subsidies for that power plant are against the law. This is European Union law and or rules. And if they do that, if they come to that conclusion, then they have to start over at square one in the negotiations. And these negotiations took years.
Yeah.
You know? And in the meantime, you could replace the whole thing with solar for a fraction of the cost and at a fraction of the time. Okay. 2 new reports. This is on the 3rd of December. 2 new reports from the DOE's National Renewable Energy Laboratory say financing, permitting, installation of labor, and other soft costs. These are the costs that do not include the hardware, everything except the hardware, make up 64% of the total price of residential solar power systems. 64% is not hardware. Mm-hmm. And this is interesting to me because, you know, we had some people coming in from Germany and Belgium to Brattleboro. Did you go to that?
I didn't. No, I'm sorry I missed it.
Yeah, it was fun. And one of the things that they pointed out was that the cost of solar in Germany is low compared to what it is in the United States. And the reason is because they have got those soft costs streamlined. So that, you know, but this also brings some other things too that are interesting. I'm just going to assume that the cost of mounts for solar is approximately equal to the cost of the panels, which is possible. I think you've got inverters that have to go in too. It's not. I don't know what the costs are, but I think
they're electronic, so they're likely to go down. They're certainly not going to go up.
Yeah. But you've got aluminum frames and you've got, you know, various stands and things that hold the thing off the roof, and all of this stuff has got a price. And I don't know what the cost of solar PVs is in terms of the percentage of the whole, but they're saying that the soft costs are 64%, and that means that if the PVs are half of the rest, then they only represent about 18% of the total cost of the installation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which means that if the price of the PVs goes up or down 10%, it's not going to change much. And but on the other hand, this is the thing that's really interesting about this. The implication of this is that if the various governments, because the various governments are in charge of the permitting costs and the various things the hoops that you have to jump through to do things, which can be extensive. If the governments can reduce those costs, then it's going to have a huge effect on the cost of installations, home installations of PVs.
Well, one of the things you're going to see happening, I'll use the word Yankee ingenuity, even if it's happening in Germany.
Yes.
There are going to be people that are figuring out how to mount these things cheaper, how to do it more efficiently, how to do it more effectively. Yeah. And it's going to change the numbers.
Well, personally, I've been watching this thing because, as you know, I get up 4 o'clock in the morning, possibly 5 o'clock. Today it was 4 o'clock. And I look at the news for a couple of hours, just looking at searches for energy news of various kinds. And I have seen, for example, IBM has a system where they can print a solar panel on a substrate. Mm-hmm. So you could have a solar panel on paper. Mm-hmm. It's not going to last very well, but you could do it. And, having spent a number of years in the graphics industry, and, working on things like the mechanisms for printing and the materials that are printed. And another thing about this, by the way, is that the metals that are involved in this do not include any heavy metals. It's like, I think it's copper, lead, and your choice of cadmium or sulfur. Mm-hmm. Copper, tin. Zinc. Copper, zinc, and your choice of cadmium and sulfur. So we could have this thing be relatively non-toxic if we go to sulfur, and possibly even if we go to cadmium. It depends upon how that's done. And we could have a thing which is very inexpensive, and it can be printed on a substrate. Well, what about printing it on metal roofing?
It's only a matter of time.
What about printing it on aluminum siding?
Huh?
Basically what happens here is the soft costs of aluminum siding and the soft costs of metal roofing are pretty well known. And the only thing that you'd have to do would be to add to that the business of an electrical hookup.
Hookups, yeah.
Well, in addition to that, you've got to deal with permitting. And the permitting in the United States is a big part of the whole. So if we can get the permitting under control in terms of costs, the price of solar continues to decline. Mm-hmm. And it continues to decline possibly dramatically for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And if that happens, then we're back to the fossil fuel industry is in trouble.
That breaks me up.
Isn't it awful? It's so sad. It's so sad. Okay, here's a good one. This is on the 4th, yesterday. Ontario will defer construction of 2 new nuclear power plants, back away from plans to refurbish operating units at Darlington and Bruce A site, and may order the shutdown of OPG's 6-unit Pickering plant prior to the unit's scheduled 2020 closing date. That's this is a big step away from nuclear, and this is from a province that has also been closing down coal plants. Mm-hmm. Why do you suppose they can do that?
No, in Ontario, is it government-produced power or is it private?
I honestly don't know. The article probably tells. It's a December 4th article at the blog. So anybody who wants to find the answer to that. But of course, the other thing is you can find that out from places like Wikipedia. Now, This next one, I have to apologize for. I put up the first, on the blog yesterday, I put up the first reference that I found to it, and the numbers were all wrong, except for the name of the location and the length of the thing. And I should have realized this right off the bat. I should have just looked at it and said, nope, can't be. A 6-mile-long U-shaped seawall costing 756 million pounds. Now, I'm not going to do the calculations completely in my head, but I think that's about $1.2 billion. Might be a little more than that. A little more. I'd like to have that little more. Do you think they'd notice if they lost it in my direction?
I'm sure more of that sticking to the fingers of the politicians.
Is planned to run across Swansea Bay, which is a bay in South Wales. It's on the I guess it's on the Bristol Channel. I don't know how far out the Bristol Channel goes, but this is the whole UK is, and this of course includes not just the UK but Ireland, is in an area where the tides are significant, very significant, and they're not the Bay of Fundy, but they're not far from there, and so they're talking about putting something over $1 billion into building a 6-mile-long U-shaped seawall, and it is going to. They say it's going to generate 420,000 megawatt hours per year, which is enough to supply electricity to 121,000 homes. And that is a significant, this thing that they're doing with tidal energy. And of course, tidal energy is, it's intermittent. The tide flows in, the tide flows out. You get it both ways.
But you know when it's happening.
You know when it's happening. You can predict it very well. And it comes in twice a day, and it goes out twice a day. In general, that's not always true. There's weird things that happen in some places, but I would expect that in this particular location, it would be twice a day, every day. And they get a lot of power when it's moving, which is 4 times a day, obviously, and none when it's not. But, I used to live down in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and you could go out and you could watch the water flowing out of Plymouth Harbor, and then when the tide changes, it comes back in. And in fact, where I lived was next to a little river, and you could actually watch this on the river. The tide would flow out, and if you stood there for 5 minutes, you'd see it coming back in again after 5 minutes. It's surprising how fast it switches from one to the other. Anyway, next. Now this is a good one. The financial world's concerns with a carbon bubble. This is their words, the article's words, and this comes from Business Spectator. I think that's an Australian organization. Just became about as concrete as they can get because Bloomberg, which is the financial place, has unveiled a new tool for investment managers to quantify the risks climate change can pose to their portfolios.
That is an interesting concept.
Isn't that an interesting concept? And, what we're talking about here could be all kinds of things. Clearly coal mining is going to be at risk from climate change, but so are things like agribiz, and there's a lot of this.
Well, you've heard me say this before. If you want to find out about climate change denial, talk to an energy guy. You want to talk about the opposite, you talk to a insurance guy.
Yeah.
And I just found out, just read the other day, they're talking about skiing. In the Northeast right now, there's 21 major ski areas. They figure by the end of the century there's going to be 4.
Yeah.
Just in the Northeast.
Yeah. That is, and it's, I don't know. I don't know. I think that makes a bunch of assumptions about climate change.
Well, one of the things they have observed, this is reality, the nighttime temperatures when they make the snow are getting warmer.
Well, you know, I didn't put it in this list, but it is in the blog. One of the things that has happened is they have found that the areas of the mountains that are appropriate for growing coffee have been going up the slopes.
In Vermont?
No, coffee. You know, I hadn't thought of that, but I bet it's true in Vermont too. No, this
You're
is
talking like Costa Rica or
Costa Rica
something, yeah.
and places like that, which was I think that was one of the Central American countries that I left off
I
that
think
list.
it was.
But yeah, the farmers who are on the low parts of the slope, who have been, you know, the great coffee comes from apparently the higher parts of the slope where it's cool. And the farmers at the lower parts who have been struggling because their coffee quality is lower are now at a point where they can't grow the coffee. And the coffee is, among other things, being attacked by funguses and things like that kill the trees. So the coffee growers have been put out of business by climate change in Central America. And you know, I've been hearing for years that the effects of climate change in the tropics would be smaller than it would be in the Arctic areas. But at the same time, you know, the effects that we've seen in the Arctic areas are profound. And
Yeah.
the people who are in denial on climate change are in denial about that. And a lot of them, you know, a lot of this, people have gone from saying, no, there is no climate change, to saying there is climate change, but it doesn't have anything to do with human activity. And if you look at the climate change historically and compare what's happening now with what has happened in the geological past, the data that we have from scientists tells us that the kind of change that we've experienced in the last 10 years would normally have happened in 1,000 years or more. And you can do a lot of adaptation in 1,000 years that you couldn't do in 10. But that's, you know, we're seeing a lot. We're seeing a lot of denial going on. Not just denial of climate change, but
Man's activities.
well, there's denial in other things too. I give you an example. I read a lot. And during the course of the day, it's not just the news. And one of the things that I've done is I've gone to the website for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and they have a nice set of papers that they wrote on climate change, which include, among other things, the effect that climate change will have on the forests in Vermont.
Okay.
I've mentioned this before,
Yeah,
I believe, but I don't know.
I've
I've
seen
done
some
it
stuff on this.
Yeah. And they talk also about the climate change in the weather and things like that. And it's pretty clear that Hurricane Irene is very likely to become a more or less normal thing in the 21st century that you can expect to happen every few years, which leaves me saying, okay, if Hurricane Irene happens every few years and maybe stronger, what's going to happen to our road infrastructure? We're going to have roads that we can't maintain because we can't afford to replace them because they happen to be next to rivers, you know, and things of that nature. But they had a thing in a paper on forestry, and they talked about the northern hardwood forests, which are made up largely of maple and birch and beech, and they talked about the upland forests that the habitats that a lot of anti-wind people want to preserve on windtops, which are spruce and fir. And they talked about the numerous species of ash that we have and the hemlocks. And their statement was, in regard to these, dealing with climate change in the 21st century, these forests are expected to be nearly eliminated in Vermont. Now, what are we, if we're going to use the idea of saving habitat on ridgetops to prevent wind turbines from going in on those ridgetops, what habitat are we trying to save? This is a valid question.
Yeah, it is.
Because if the habitat is going to be lost anyway, then we're not saving the habitat that's there. We can certainly replace these habitats with others that would be amenable to species that would be nice to think about living on our ridgetops, but they will not be necessarily the same species that are there now.
And it's not going to happen automatically.
It's not going to happen automatically, I don't think, although I have a close friend who says, let nature do it, take its course. And, you know, there are people who are very intelligent who have differing views on this, but I don't think that the idea of saying no to a wind turbine or a wind farm can be validly based on the idea of protecting the habitat that is there now. And there are reasons why people would want to oppose these things that have to do with appearance or have to do with noise or whatever. And having lived on a mountaintop, I can tell you, I know what it's like to be able to hear things at very great distances, because I could hear a locomotive running from 8 miles away. I think I told you about that. And I could hear one side of a conversation a person was having on a phone from half a mile away.
Wow.
You know, it's amazing. I could hear in New Hampshire tractor trailers that had, the only place they could have been was on Route 91.
How far away were you?
About 4 miles.
Yeah, well, I can believe that.
Yeah. And of course I was hearing the all right, now this brings us into our next thing, which is this morning, the 5th of December. An alliance of corporations and conservative activists. These people are no doubt Tea Party members who believe in, you know, they're libertarians who believe that people should be allowed to do anything they want.
Anything they want to.
Right. They are mobilizing to penalize homeowners who install their own solar panels, casting them as, quote, free riders, end quote, in a sweeping new offensive against renewable energy. This comes from the Guardian, which is a UK publication, but obviously they're talking about the United States, but I didn't get this directly from them. I got it from a place called Raw Story. But I find this really kind of fascinating. They are saying that people should be allowed to do whatever they want, and somehow or another, they're taking this to a point where they're saying, if you're going to put up your own solar panels and produce your own electricity and put it on the internet, not the internet, the grid, the electric grid, we want to tax that because you're a free rider.
Mm-hmm.
And
so wait a second, let me see if I get this right. Now, if my name is Vermont Yankee, and I'm generating electricity and I'm feeding it into the grid, they want to charge me for that.
no, they don't want to charge you for that.
They want to charge the guy
because
that's putting up the
They want to
solar
charge
power.
the people who put up solar. and the only reason I can think of for doing this, and this is what's scary to this is what's scary to the fossil fuel groups, is that there isn't any fuel being used in solar and wind. And so the person who owns it isn't paying for it. That makes him a free rider because he's not paying for fuel.
Yeah, right. And that's
So
where the money is.
That's where the money is. And they want to keep that money where that money is. And they, you know, anyway, now this is a good one. The next one from today. After suffering a power outage at last year's game, NFL, Super Bowl, remember that?
Vaguely.
Vaguely, yeah.
I don't follow football much.
I don't follow it much either, but of course I was doing the blog and looking at energy news at the time, and of course I sat down one morning and put in something about energy and came up with about 250 extra hits because of the Super Bowl.
Well, yeah, you don't want it to happen.
I have to look at these
watching a
things. This
football
takes
game.
time. Yeah, that's right. A football game that is shut down for electrical problem is not fun. All right, they have figured out, the NFL has figured out what they're going to do about this. And what do you suppose they're going to do?
Put up solar panels.
They entered into an agreement with PSEG, which is going to put up. NFL has an environmental program The NFL has an environmental program, and the environmental program of the NFL got involved in this.
Okay.
I mean, there's so many companies that have these environmental programs. You'd say, why in the world, why does IKEA have an environmental program? Why does Google? I mean, IKEA, at least, a lot of their stuff is derived from wood, and they want to, you know, it would make economic sense for the distant future to maintain the forests. But Google, what are they maintaining? They're maintaining the plastic trees, the software. But the NFL, why do they have an environmental program? They do. In order to provide renewable energy for Super Bowl LXVIII. And what's that, 48? I guess it is.
LXVIII, yeah.
So that was something I found interesting. And
PSEG is Public Service Electric and Gas. It's
is that New
largest
Jersey?
utility in New Jersey.
Yeah. And New Jersey, PSEG and New Jersey have been putting in renewable energy resources like mad, just like mad. Jason Cooper told me about flying into one of the airports down there, and the last time I took a flight, which went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, it went through Newark. Mm-hmm. And because of what Jason had said, I was pretty careful to look out the window as we were coming down and taking off from Newark just to see what it looked like. And he was absolutely right. There's rooftop after rooftop, big commercial rooftops that are covered with solar panels. And one of the things
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that was interesting about this is that the Hurricane Sandy damaged the solar panels, mm-hmm. but it did very little damage, and the damage that was done could be dealt with getting those panels back online as soon as they were hooked up to the utilities. So, yeah, PSEG is an interesting operation, and you know this, and actually, as I think about it, there are a lot of utilities that are interesting. The idea that Hinkley C is going to cost $1.6 billion to hook it to the grid. This is the grid tie for Hinkley C, and that I think is really
just the grid tie.
Just the grid tie. It's not part of the $26 billion package. It's just the grid tie. And people who are against renewable power are constantly talking about how renewable power stresses the grid. Well, Hinkley C was going to stress the grid to the tune of $1.6 billion. And it's hard for me to imagine that that they couldn't have done that a whole lot cheaper by doing it in any of a number of other ways. But of course, the guy who was in charge of the Solar Energy Association, the Installers Association in Britain, wrote to the Prime Minister, and he said, if you people wanted, what was it, 5 gigawatts or 3.2 gigawatts was what it was. It was exactly 5 times Vermont Yankee.
Okay.
Out of 2 reactors. If you wanted 3.2 gigawatts, we could have put in the solar to provide that much power.
The solar equivalent.
The solar equivalent, which is not 3.2, it's going to be more like 10.
Yeah.
But he said we could put it in at a far lower price.
And a lot quicker.
We could put it in 2 years. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about one of the arguments that they're having in favor of getting Hinkley C going, which is going to take at least 10 years to do, but one of the arguments that they have had is that they're running into what they call the energy drought because they have not been taking care of their infrastructure, their generating infrastructure. So they have a lot of generating infrastructure that has to be replaced. And that means that they've got big costs coming up. And so they were willing to bite the bullet and go after Hinkley C to the tune of a huge amount of huge cost because although it would be coming in 8 years too late, it was still going to be addressing that problem. I think they could have addressed it much faster using solar. And some of the developments in energy storage, really interesting.
Well, they're still working on an old model.
Yeah,
And the model is changing as we speak,
that's right.
and they're not pursuing that.
They are.
They're still sitting in there in blinders, and
That's
this
right.
is the way it's always been.
That's
This
right.
is the way it's going to be.
That's right.
And there's eventually going to be forced to find out that they're wrong.
Well, they're basically, I think, from the point of view of their business models, they're manufacturing buggy whips when the world is moving to the automobile. And they're saying, we've been making buggy whips for 50 years or 70 years or whatever it is. We've always made money on buggy whips. Buggies are not going to disappear. These new cars are a newfangled thing, and that's what they're doing with energy. But they're trying to enforce it. And this thing of ALEC, it was that had that, it was that coalition of people who were going to try to get solar panels on people's rooftops taxed. The reason they're doing that is because they want to slow down change. And frankly, I think it's kind of like slowing down the tide. One of the things that people don't realize is that the world is going to change. It is going to change. And if you could stop change in the United States, all you would be doing would be holding the United States back. Mm-hmm. It's going to change elsewhere. It's going to change in Central America. The people in Central America are going to stop buying oil. I don't know that they were ever very dependent on coal, but if they were, they're going to stop buying that. And when that happens, those people are going to have local resources that put local money back into their local economy instead of shipping it to Texas or Louisiana or the Middle East. And when that happens, all of a sudden they start getting more prosperous. And since renewable power produces something like 10 jobs for every job that the same power output is produced by nuclear, a little bit fewer than that than the same output is produced by coal, they're going to have local employment that's better. Mm-hmm. They're going to have their conditions improved, and who's going to pay for that? Well, the people who are going to pay are going to be the Americans in the United States if we don't do the same thing, because we're going to be paying the higher and higher and higher prices that will have to be paid for fossil fuels and nuclear. And that's how we pay for it. But so I think, quite honestly, that these conservative groups and ALEC and the various industries that are doing this are anti-American. That's my opinion, for what it's worth. Maybe somebody could explain that in a way that would make sense to somebody. And this is an interesting thing that came up in the news today. It was in a publication called Renew Economy. And Renew Economy had an article in which they say the marginal cost of solar and wind energy is close enough to zero because there is no fuel cost. If that is the situation, which apparently it is, then the energy price in a 100% wind and solar market is going to be close to zero, because that's the way the market is structured. So if that happens, who's going to invest in wind and solar? And I think that's a really interesting question.
Well, they won't be selling fuel anymore.
They won't be selling fuel.
But they are going to be selling capabilities.
Yes, that's right.
That's where the money's going to be.
Yeah, I think this article is not 100% right in its assumptions. For one thing, they assume that the structure of the market is going to remain what it is. But we have seen prices go to zero.
We've seen them go negative.
We've seen them go negative, And that thing about the price in southern Italy of wholesale price of power goes to zero during peak demand times, because that happens to be the time when the solar panels that people have put on their rooftops are dumping power onto the grid.
How convenient for the users.
Yeah, it is very convenient for the users. There's another thing that isn't in this group. We've got through the entire group. How much time do we have? About 2 minutes. We started a couple of minutes late. The thing about Hinckley C and the cost of putting it on the grid reminds me of this thing. I forget the power company on Long Island. Maybe you know.
Well, it was Lilco, but now it's been taken over. It's a non-profit. It's run by the state.
Oh, okay. They were going to spend a couple $100 million on upgrading the grid in the eastern end of Long Island.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
the reason was because the population...
That's like Montauk Point.
Yeah, the population is moving east, and there's no production facilities out there, so they have to bring in power from elsewhere. And what they found was that people are putting in solar PVs. And because they're putting in solar PVs, it's unnecessary to upgrade the grid.
Well, that makes sense.
Because the solar PVs are coming on at the peak demand load times. And so they're negating the need for that grid at the peak demand times.
That's a high-income area.
Yeah, so I understand.
Eastern Long Island is pretty high income. That's the Hamptons.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So they got the money for the solar. They're not worrying about subsidies or worrying about getting the government to pay for it.
These are people who have a lot of money,
Yeah.
and they're very interested in maintaining their money. And so what do? They buy solar.
Yeah, it's to their self-interest.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we're at the end of the day, and I will thank anybody who has watched through, if anybody has. Do you think anybody's watching this show?
I haven't met anybody yet.
I actually got stopped on the street by somebody who was commenting on it.
Oh, yeah, good. Good. No, nobody's told me they've seen me yet.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank anybody who has watched for watching, and we will be back next week. So, Tom Finnell, George Harvey, and I will say see you later.